Statement of the problem. We've been on this cycle since 1970s when Nixon declared drug abuse as public enemy number one. It's interesting to note, however, that during Nixon's tenure, the initiatives he established did not necessarily result in exponential increase in the prison population. It's legislation that occurred in the 80s and up to now that have resulted in that dynamic. Between 1974 and 2014, the prison population increased 500%, while criminal justice spending increased over 487%. And between 1972 and 2009, all of the initiatives that resulted in the increased population, increased spending, only resulted in a 0.3% decrease or deterrence in crime. So, what's missing? Well, the research examines how human agency and self-determination may hold the answer to why, all things held equal, some people succeed and prevail in reintegration and some do not. So it was important to determine why those who succeed prevail and why those who do not succeed fail, and how human agency and self-determination may play an important part in learning more about this dynamic. Now, as a matter of background.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the bipartisan leaders, which began at 8 o'clock and was completed 2 hours later. I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad wherever they are in the world. It will be government-wide, pulling together the 9 different fragmented areas within the government in which this problem is now being handled. And it will be nationwide in terms of a new educational program that we trust will result from the discussions that we have had. If we're going to have a successful offensive, we need more money. In order to defeat this enemy, which is causing such great concern, and correctly so to so many American families, money will be provided to the extent that it is necessary and to the extent that it will be useful.
So Nixon put all he had into consolidating. I think that he did that. There's probably very little problem with his consolidating and putting money behind this. But what this established was the beginnings of what we often call the war on drugs. The war on drugs resulted in the Comprehensive Crime Act of 1984, which increased federal penalties for cultivation, possession, or transfer of marijuana. Part of the initiatives were to take away judicial discretion in favor of determinate sentencing rules that gave them no choice but to follow those established rules in sentencing individuals for drug crimes. The Anti-Drug Act of 1988 established these new federal offenses and sanctions, and it resulted in a repercussive increase in the prison population. Now we have the Federal Anti-Crime Act moving along to 1990 that provided financial incentives to states that implemented the recommendations of the Sentencing Commission. All of this failed to deter crime. It increased criminal justice costs, and more offenders were incarcerated for longer terms as criminal justice spending increased exponentially. None of this resulted in any significant national reduction in recidivism over long term periods beyond 5 years. Well, in the interest of attempting to correct this dynamic of nonviolent offenders being put away for up to life sentences, the U.S. Attorney announced $173 million for criminal justice reform. So on March 4th, 2014, began legislation that would result in many hundreds, if not thousands, of nonviolent offenders being returned to society.
The statistics cannot be ignored. So let's look at the statistics. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Think about that. Our incarceration rate is 4 times higher than China's. We keep more people behind bars than the top 35 European countries combined. And it hasn't always been the case, this huge explosion in incarceration rates. In 1980, there were 500,000 people behind bars in America. 500,000 people in 1980. Today, there are 2.2 million. It has quadrupled since 1980. Our prison population has doubled in the last 2 decades alone. But here's the thing. Over the last few decades, we've also locked up more and more nonviolent drug offenders than ever before for longer than ever before. Every year, we spend $80 billion to keep folks incarcerated. $80 billion. But here's the good news. I've commuted the sentences of dozens of people sentenced under old drug laws that we now recognize were unfair. And yesterday I announced that I'm commuting dozens more.
So President Obama was the first president in decades to leave office with a federal prison population lower than when he took office. He granted early release to 46,000 nonviolent prisoners. And prior to leaving office, an additional almost 2,000 were granted clemency. Well, this is all good on one hand, but the concern of the research study was, okay, if all things have been held equal and we've done all of our research on restorative justice and probation and parole and what types of societal things can support prisoners in reintegration and make them successful, we've got all that research down pat. But if the existing paradigms and existing restorative justice interventions have to date been or historically been less successful in reducing recidivism, then this rush of nonviolent offenders into our society could exacerbate an already existent problem. So the purpose of the study is to explore from the perspectives of formerly incarcerated individuals who have been successfully reintegrated, what types of turning points occurred in their lives that led to their final decision to desist from criminal activities. What facilitated their decisions to desist? It's also designed to offer knowledge that may augment existing reentry programs. This is not meant to replace, it's not meant to be a whole new thing, a new trend. It's meant to augment what already exists in the community to increase reduction in recidivism for their programs and facilitate sustained reintegration success for the individuals who go through those programs. It's hopeful that the results of this study can be of benefit to the Michigan Prisoner Reentry Program in some way as well. So the significance of this is have been two identified areas of reintegration research that are lacking. First, a lack of focus on turning points in an individual's decision to desist, and a failure to acknowledge the implications of human agency in desistance decisions. Most of the existing research measures recidivism at the 3 to 5 year marks. In doing the literary review for this study, I noted a particular quotation that really augmented the foundation of this study. A participant in one of the studies said, "Too many people rely on the treatment. If you don't develop a sense of who you are, then no program in the world is going to help." The reintegration methodology that exists to date has been founded on rational choice theory, which relies on social control, the carrot and reward type of thing. It results in status violations that often constitute grounds for reincarceration, and impact on recidivism is negligible. 67, almost 68% were rearrested within 3 years of release. Within 5 years, almost 77% were rearrested. Now, of those, almost 57% were rearrested in the first year. Reoffenses occurred within 21 months in this particular study. Now, research gap here is overlooking the implications of human agency, self-determination, personal choice, individual control over decision making, and the degree to which they influence success or unsuccessful reintegration. The foundation of the research model in this study is Emergent interactive agency model of social learning theory. Social learning theory came first, and then it was augmented into the Emergent interactive agency model, which basically says this: that autonomous agency and mechanical agency are not mutually exclusive, but they work in tandem. And self-determination is an emergent dynamic. It occurs as a process. It occurs and develops over time.